Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Microstrategy World 2021. Today, we have a presentation for you on top architecture tips for MicroStrategy. And I'm joined today by Ryan Forsythe, five-time community master, 20 years of experience with MicroStrategy, to talk about the architectural basics and how to build a future-proofed architecture that can drive adoption and better use of MicroStrategy. My name is Rob Davis. I'm a Vice President of Solution Management here at MicroStrategy, and I just want to introduce you to a couple of the logistical items before we get started. You'll notice in your Social 27 platform here, there is a chat window where you can converse between yourselves in the audience. There's also a moderated Q&A tab where you can add questions that we will put to Ryan at the end of the presentation in the Q&A. Also note that there are emojis in the bottom right of the presentation window, so you can comment on the presentation as it unfolds. So without further ado, over to you, Ryan, and let's start the presentation on top architecture tips.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. Welcome all. As Rob mentioned, my name is Ryan Forsythe. I have been working with MicroStrategy since version 4, so quite a while ago. So yeah, 22 years of experience with MicroStrategy. Worked with a lot of different customers and organizations, doing consulting on MicroStrategy, probably 40, 50 different customers and organizations, and 5-time community master, programs. So get that from being able to provide tips and solutions to people in the MicroStrategy community. So kind of a lot of the value, be able to bring that, obviously being a MicroStrategy community contributor. MicroStrategy alumni from many millennia ago, it feels like. And I've also developed an advanced MicroStrategy architecture course. So this is where I brought some of the content from. And some kind of personal things. Enjoy playing piano, cooking, kind of a DIYer. And this Sunday, I'm all about Go Chiefs. So ready for that second Super Bowl win here. So anyways, all right. So, when we talk about MicroStrategy, and really most of this is going to focus on, kind of the architected, the semantic, kind of architecture within MicroStrategy, as we speak about this. But, to really, I really kind of want to stress that doing MicroStrategy right is getting that foundation, getting that architecture right. It's really like getting the foundation of your house, building a house correctly. And you get a bad foundation, it crumbles, or it's not able to scale, and that's when it becomes so much more difficult to work with MicroStrategy. But the customers that get that that architecture right and are able to build onto that architecture, find it so much easier to work with, and really, tend to work very well. And unfortunately, we've gone into more customers than I would like that haven't quite got it right. They're like, we're having problems. We have to kind of go through a process of, refactoring that architecture and really setting it up correctly. And once they're doing that, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is so much easier. And so, it seems tough to do it, but, part of it stems back from, one of my prior session I just did is, data is as much, science as and art. And so it's really kind of understanding both of those. But, kind of going into it too is that, understanding the history of MicroStrategy. So MicroStrategy was developed or, started in 1989, not as MicroStrategy, but as a consulting operation, with Michael and Sanju, doing a consulting project to DuPont in Delaware. And so they really sought to standardize how to query databases using objects. And really the methodology on that was, based off ROLAP, so relational online analytical processing. And so when you go to understand, what, ROLAP was, the advantages were that query flexibility. You're able to change it, on the fly and change that level of detail. You're able to, handle large amounts of data, and you're also able to leverage, database functionalities. Because on the flip side, there were also technologies of MOLAP, so multi-dimensional online analytical processing. cubes. So obviously today, MicroStrategy is now a little bit of both. But when we talk about the architecture and reports, and still be able to do leverage a lot of the core aspects of being able to ask pretty much any question that you want to be able to ask, or letting users do that. It's being able to leverage that role app functionality. And so, that also, there are some disadvantages to that. So performance, large amounts of data required massive computing power. And then, and you also relegate to simpler queries. So it's unable to perform, multiple passes or complex queries. So then they answered that by allowing for both multi-pass SQL and aggregate awareness. So that's adding in an aggregate table to be able to handle different levels of that query. So if I'm just analyzing things at the year or at a product category and in year level, I don't need to go through as much data. So I can do this table, pre-aggregate that, and then go through. So obviously, as time when 30 gigabytes was a large amount of data, that was one of MicroStrategy's sweet spots. But many things within the SQL engine are still based on that core I want to say core algorithm and architecture. So we have to actually understand that as we go into this. And so, understanding that that's how understand what the SQL engine is doing and what it's, and what it's doing and to choose some of these things, and also what things are to use and what things not to use. So the MicroStrategy architect, it's probably a little bit of self-promotion. It's also a little bit of, this is what kind of really, the successful. And for those of you that are trying to come up, the areas you need to kind of expand on, ensure that you actually cover, in order to be a successful, architect. And so the MicroStrategy architect isn't just knowing how to create a schema object and do those sort of things. It's a part of it, but you really have to be both a MicroStrategy architect, a data architect, as well as a business analyst. And so, the data architecture goes into, you need to understand what the data is. If I'm looking at a comments table in relation to a cases table, and if there's not always a comment to that case, but knowing somebody might pull on comment, well, you don't want to drop that data. You have to actually understand that relation, that 1 to 0, 1 to 1, 1 to many relationship, as well as referential integrity, right? So you don't want to have them put on an attribute and then that automatically drops a whole set of data. So doing that, and then business analyst. So being able to not just say, okay, we're mapping in these relationships, but actually sitting there and saying, okay, well, with this data that we have status code A and type code 1, 2, 3 is an intracompany transfer, but you have to do that in order to do this or whatever, and have these complex filters, understanding what the user what's going to benefit the user. So do we need to actually create some other kind of characteristic attributes? Are there other things that we need to do in order to make this an easier process for the end user to actually do analytics? Because ultimately they're business people. They may understand enough, but they're not going to understand the intricacies of some of the data in those elements. So being able to think along all of those elements, and ultimately, I mentioned this in my last session too, is not deliver to requirements, but to deliver to an experience or deliver to the goals. And once start thinking that way, that's where the MicroStrategy architect succeeds. And so that person is typically very much a techno-functional, pretty deep both technically and pretty deep and broad functionally. So you don't actually find that, if that's your role and you're weak in one of those, I can't stress enough that that's an area of development. And that will get you to being, really both a critical part of your organization and a critical part of your organization's success. And that's that I can't stress that enough. So that MicroStrategy SQL engine, right? So the algorithm is going to identify such things as which tables to use, which comp select, which columns to join on for tables and temporary tables and subqueries, do the table ordering, the use of distinct, as well as some other performance elements to there. So understanding that that's where what it's using, and that's how it's been for since DSS Agent 4, and especially version 7 and through on through is that's what it does. So that's really where we need to look at. But what I'll also say is that back 20 and 30 years ago, I think we were also relying on much more conformed data models, data that was architected a certain way, and we had our snowflakes or we had our stars set up. These days, it's a hybrid of everything, right? You still will probably have a snowflake schema, but you also might have a little bit of a star, and you might also just have attributes that are on a core broad fact table. You're not creating a little snowflake for each and every column on a 200 column table. So it's ultimately kind of a hybrid of that, but kind of understanding some of those. But the first step that I can unequivocally say that you need to do in order to be successful, and this is actually with almost any analytics application, use database views. Use database views. So as I said, that data modeling and architecture typically isn't clean anymore. There's lots of nulls. There isn't that one-to-one or one-to-many relationship sometimes. So if I have a comments table, I would need to make sure I actually pre-join to the case table and do an outer join on that, because more likely I will want that outer join in any event. And then not everything needs to be done in MicroStrategy. If you want to do an outer join, and that's how you have the architecture, users can't perform outer joins in web. So, you already start, making it difficult for users, or, you have to have that pre-built report in order for users to do it and have set those VLDB settings to make that work. So, let's push that logic down there. And to some extent, I try to make it so that, MicroStrategy, the MicroStrategy development owns the MicroStrategy views. This really isn't a database perspective. If you want your own if we want our own schema, which I typically ask for, you have your own subset of schema, so it can actually even one for one. If you started out as everything is tables, I can just create all the views as select star with the same name, point to that new schema, and boom, I'm done. Switching over to views, and then once that's done, we can embed logic. We can put null checks in columns. We can do some additional logic. And so, within that, it allows for that intermediate fixes while ETL and data modeling catch up. So if you do null checks, you're not going to get the benefit, or other functions on a column, you're not going to get the benefit of indexes, but it delivers to what the business needs. And then you can follow it up with indexes. As I mentioned, it solves those modeling shortcomings. If you do need to set up something which is a select distinct to get a distinct set of records, and you don't have that as a predefined lookup table, we can do that. Reduces the need for rework should additional performance tuning be required. And then also reduces the need for apply simple functions, within MicroStrategy, make it platform dependent. So if you want, right now, so being able to push that down to the views makes it platform independent. It's kind of easier to change a view if I'm switching over from SQL Server to Snowflake or Single Store or some other database, versus if I need to go back through every single other object in MicroStrategy that has an apply simple statement. In certain databases, we can use materialized views, so we get a performance, kind of hit or improvement by leveraging materialized views of the database. And then also even reduce the need for database storage for some fields or records, right? If we don't want to put that, from a table perspective, we can, calculate that in a view, predefine, price times quantity. Yes, we can do it in a fact. We can also do it in a view. We can do it in a persistent computed column at the table, or we can do it at the table. But it gives you that flexibility. And as I mentioned, taking that logic and, not even in putting in MicroStrategy and putting it the view, then letting the database, the architecture catch up. So a question the prior session was being able to, the kind of concept behind modeled data in the warehouse versus being able to be responsive for the business and be able to do things. Views allow us to be responsive. We can also do cross-database views, right? Performance isn't great, and I would even argue you'd almost want to do cross-database views rather than multi-sourcing, just because you always have to bring the data over. There's just a lot of different things we can do, even in production. If I have to, try and test out an index, and I don't have that same data in dev, but so we can, copy the production table, do a different index, point that view right over there and test that and see how everything works through Integrity Manager and not actually impact our production table until we're ready. So a lot of different cases for that. And you might also have more computing power, so you want a true apples to apples comparison. So these are kind of, some of the things within MicroStrategy that, while they're there, there's a reason why they're there, but at the same time, just because they're there, I wouldn't use them. Freeform SQL tables is a big thing. I kind of see this on community a lot, and I cringe because, I say this should be a last resort. Once again, this comes from where you don't have any control at the database level. If we have control at least over our own schema, there's no need for freeform SQL tables in there. You might do some freeform SQL in a MTDI cube just to get a specific query, but it does, it minimizes your capability of drilling and relating, but also when a view runs, the database engine optimizer is actually going to go through and parse that and potentially kind of deconstruct that and optimize the usage of the data. Whereas typically a freeform SQL table is taking everything in there. It's not kind of interpolating the filter and doing that. So it's going to be a lot more overhead from a performance and query perspective, as well as it also ties to a specific MicroStrategy database instance. So you need to manage that if you want to change where everything's pointing to. There's just a lot of complexity to it that if you actually get that MicroStrategy view schema or MicroStrategy owned schema in your database, there's no need for it. So as I mentioned this, pass-through versus functions. Yes, technically pass-through functions are functions, apply simple, apply ag, and apply comparison. But, what they do is they allow users to directly pass SQL syntax in a query. And so, yes, case function, case type things, where I see that a lot, or, if this, then that, or some casting of data or whatever. So that's a lot of times where I see it, but once again, it starts becoming database specific. So first off, MicroStrategy, also has, over 300 built-in functions. And how that's actually done in the database depends on which database instance, version you choose. So it'll change with SQL Server 2014 to 17 as you upgrade. It will change if you say, I have this on SQL Server, now I'm on Snowflake, or I'm on MySQL. It allows you to change and mitigate that risk by using the built-in functions if you want to do that, right? So always, always, always use a built-in function unless it's unavailable. And then your second option is to implement it in a view. There are, like I said, there might be a few specific cases where I might use a, apply simple function. And I think sometimes where I'd use it recently was there were some things that just weren't quite working correctly in developer and had to do the apply simple. But, once again, it's simply more so when somebody wants to use a slightly more complex case statement or things like that. It's typically what I consider a cheap shortcut. Yes, it's easier to develop, but yes, if you have to go through and you're changing database platforms or going through certain upgrades, it can be a nightmare. So when I come into an organization, customer, I see a lot of apply simple. I kind of make it a point to let's cut that out, and also slowly change over or convert things that can be converted from apply simple to to a built-in function. All right, one of the biggest architecture mistakes, and this comes from Microstrategy tutorial. So, sadly, there was a lot of things that weren't even, from the tutorial perspective that were, correct. But so as you see here, this table, order fact. So our order fact table is typically comprised of, either a order detail ID, order fact is typically like an order ID. So that's a primary key on there. And so, but here we actually see, employee, day, days to ship, the order itself, which is probably our order ID, phone usage. So some of these things are one-to-one, some of these things are one-to-many. Now, but what most people forget to do is just defining a parent-child relationship, whether that's to the, the primary key or primary keys on that table. And this even happens more so with a wide table because you might have a compound, kind of a joint compound key in there, so you need to use that. But when you don't do that, okay, that and as mentioned, all tables should have either a key or a natural primary or a natural key. And so this impacts, like the aggregate awareness. This impacts, can create improper joins. If you have multiple tables that have similar keys, it may try to join that. It may try to join employee to day, on something that's completely unrelated. If that's how the keys on multiple tables are set up, and so these are kind of the things that are one of the biggest red flags, red herrings that I come into companies and organizations when I see this kind of stuff. That okay, we probably have to go through an architecture refactor. And these are the kind of little things in there that make it so that, oh yeah, things just aren't happening correctly. This is really just where I see that. And so, there's that, overall instability, potential wrong table selection, unnecessary joins or improper joins. So, getting that parent-child relationship set up, getting the data architecture set up in relation to it is kind of one of the biggest elements within here. And some other kind of tips in this. So using the specified key checkbox. So when we actually go back down to here, the key specified is the true key for the warehouse. Well, that's not the case. And one of the other ones I'll talk about is this logical size. So, MicroStrategy introduced some of these things to overcome some of the deficiencies of when customers, do this. And so using the specified key checkbox is, basically unchecking that and making sure it will do an aggregation as well as a couple of other things in there to do it. But if you have your keys correct, then, you really shouldn't use that, specified key check, unchecking that one. Another element is, not using manual mapping. So when, one of the original core features of MicroStrategy was, okay, when we bring in a new table, it will automatically recognize that day and product and year are these attributes because they map to this. And so it will bring that table in automatically. Now we're aggregate aware. Great in a time when our data architecture was clean. I've never come upon clean data architecture anymore. And you may not even need it, right? I mean, and you may not want it. Insert timestamp. You just may want that as a common column, but insert timestamp is different for each and every single table if you want to display that on your on a report, but it's not a common, attribute. And so, now you bring that in and these columns invariably get, mapped to your date ID, right? That's That's another common one. Date can mean different things in a lot of different ways. So whether or not you want that to be mapped to date, or if you want that to create it as its own date ID, might be a different thing. So there's a lot of different things, but we've developed toolkits that go and help us map in all the columns, even if it's a 200 column table within a half hour for the actual kind of scripts to run, but about 2 hours with kind of just doing some of the additional analysis. So we can do all of that and map things in correctly. So basically avoid using manual mapping unless your data architecture is stellar. Another thing, not using compound keys. You map city to city name. In there. Well, city in a lot of places is not just city, especially in the US. We have a lot of different Washingtons. We have Washington, Virginia, Washington, DC, probably a bunch of other ones. So it's city, state, city, province, is really the key in there. So you actually need to have city, state as a compound key. You can have a description form, as city if you want. And then you can also add on other description forms, just city, city state code, however you want to do that, but ensuring that you have that singular value, which enables your drilling and also potentially it eliminates potential double counting. Or month is also another thing that I've come across, just not all the time, but it's a doozy when you see it, right? They map month to month number. August exists in multiple years. So if I just put August on a report, I'm going to get August for all years versus August of 2020. And so it needs to be month number plus year, so 2020-08 or however you want to do it. You can do it 8-2020, but so that's the other thing. Manipulating that logical size. Typically a case of where things aren't architected correctly. Not to say that you will never do it, but it's rare. I find it rare that I've had to do that. And so you're manipulating the logical size to make it so that Microstrategy SQL engine will choose one table or a set of certain tables over other tables. So once again, if you're architected correctly, you won't have to set that set that logical size element. Microstrategy will automatically do that. So if you add in another table at a higher or lower level, it'll evaluate it based off that logical size, and it'll automatically reevaluate it if you put in another table. But it will also increase the size of that table the more key attributes there are. So that's kind of where that parent-child relationship comes into play, and where some of that comes in. So another element is the ID as description. So you always include, a lot of people include the ID as description, just have an ID for an attribute. That works for some, but in a lot of cases, you may want to do both an ID and a description on there, even if it's the same column. One thing is Microstrategy will do, kind of bring that filter. If that's being used as a filter, that's the filter that's in there as the ID. So you may have a 0 or a 1 flags or something. So maybe I want to do a case statement or a -1 for a referential value, but I just want to case it in the description field to say, okay, case -1 NA. Sort of thing, instead of doing that, on the ID, because it also may impact your query performance on joins and some of those things. So, generally doing, having that, the ID, create a separate description form automatically, even if it's the same value, just gives you a lot more flexibility, as well as allows you kind of change out even that you might notice if you do need to create a compound key, you have issues unless you, kind of copy everything over, duplicate your schema, make it, and then, migrate that back up. So, a couple different reasons why you may want to do it, but you also may need to take VLDB options into account. So there's, select if on template, select, attribute forms, or select other attributes if on template. So you may want to take that into account as well. And then just not doing adequate data analysis. So, you still kind of go back to the Ralph Kimball method of, there should never be a null column in a data warehouse unless it's a true null, meaning 0 is different than null. So typically on aggregation or on calculated values or aggregatable values, everything else should have something. And, we probably don't do everything in there, but at least have most of the things that you may potentially join on, or kind of filter on, as, kind of nullable, or, understanding where you need to do outer joins, some of those things are critical. So if you're at a bare minimum putting that into the views, just doing a null check, and, if it's an integer, putting it as 0 or a -1, or if it's a, string field, character field, then you're doing it as quote, a single quote -1 or NA, you do that. So at least you ensure that you have, joins, proper joins in there, and you're not dropping records and some of those things. So as I mentioned, the little asterisk, in terms of some of these things, there's an exception to a rule. You may not, you may still need to do some of these things, but it's the exception, not the rule. And so just kind of probably one other, tip that I kind of see in here and want to is that leverage some additional date forms, especially when you're talking about your month, your quarter, your year, dates or, time periods in the hierarchy. Add on, the time period begin and or end date. So what that does is it allows us to then, as we're doing filtering, allow some of the dynamic date functionality, by saying the month end date or the month start date is in or between this value or whatever versus month ID, which is 2020-08, right? You can't really do that, but you add on those, the period begin and end dates, then that allows you to do either betweens, or the dynamic dates, a lot of, things similar to that. Another one is, time period from current. So this is another, good thing that they'll put in the view, right? Even if everything else is coming off a straight date, month, quarter, year table, do time period on from current. It can still, typically not a huge overhead, but once again allows filtering and sorting based on the calculation of that, date difference. So I can always put in some filters or some things where, period is 0, right? Or, which means the current month or current quarter or current year, or, 1 is a prior month, or -1 is the next month. So just allows you to kind of easily do that without having to maybe go into some of the dynamic date elements, but be able to allow a lot of flexibility. Go ahead and add in the time period number of days. Gives you that, number of days within the time period, maybe used for fact extensions, or additional views to do some calculations, right, for averages. Go ahead and put in, time period, the prior period, prior year period for our transformations. Let's just go ahead and build some of those common things in there that we'll likely use. And so that way we can do that. There's still more that I typically put in there, but these are the common ones across all time periods, whether it's, a month, quarter, week, whatever that I typically just include by default. All right. Well, that's, those are kind of like just some of the top tips I continually see from, community that I brought out from, kind of some highlights from the, course material I've done for kind of advanced architecture. And, kind of really open it up to, kind of Q&A at this point. Maybe have any questions about the content or, just general thoughts on, kind of architecture approach.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan. Some real actionable, practical steps there. That's good. I do have a few questions in the chat here. First one is from Matthew. And this goes back to your recommendation to use views whenever possible. He says, don't views perform worse, at least using Oracle?
It's usually such a minimal hit that I will argue day and night that your value to use views, even if it's a select star, is going to lend so much more to your organizational agility and ability. So being able to add something and then come back and put it to the table. So yeah, there's certainly performance hits, especially the more logic you put into it. absolutely unequivocally, your goal is you're taking it as technical debt, and and I have a whole process in Jira and project management methodology to do that. But you do that, and Select Star, I would argue, is such a negligible hit that you do that, and then you evaluate, right? See if it's not a big performance hit, go for it. So you're much more flexibility, and also takes away from you needing to put that into MicroStrategy, which is going to, there's more ways that you can cause poor performance by forcing people to put it into MicroStrategy than just putting it at the database level.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Another good question here from Jim. I remember in the past having troubles when I make all attributes from different hierarchies parents of the primary key field on a wide fact table. This led to bad joins to the other fact tables that contain one of the attributes but not the other. Was I blaming the wrong mistake, and can I safely make all attributes parents of the primary key field?
Right. So it's a little tough, right? And this is the kind of the toughest part of MicroStrategy, and I'd still like to see some improvements in the SQL generation engine in it. But architected correctly, everything should work correctly. And so whether that's still also having a multi-key fact table, so day, employee, and some things are the natural, whether it's a natural primary key or a other primary or a actual primary key, you can do that. So to some extent, I could see employee and date potentially being a primary key there, but once again, then it becomes a little bit more difficult as you build this out, and it depends on how much how broad your kind of fact tables are in your subject areas. So it's hard to say it's a right answer, but there are ways to actually do it and do it correctly. So I would still probably say I'd blame it a little bit on something that was in that architecture. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but yeah, there's kind of two different, a couple of different approaches, to it, from the single primary key versus multi-key and joint child, approach.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Question from Julian here. Coming back to the MicroStrategy tutorial project, date or integer ID for your date attribute?
I've gotten more to the date. I think the date ID as an integer was something that was very, I think that's been a legacy architecture thing. Now ultimately, especially databases that are partitioned are, you can partition on date, and that's where they're getting their performance, is by doing the partitioning. So if I'm filtering frequently on date, and you don't want to have to do a date join to the date table to do a date function, right? And you have more flexibility there. So absolutely date as a date, but also make sure don't use date time. If it's, that's another kind of small thing that tends to happen, people using date time versus this is just a true date. So, make sure you don't do that.
Good. Question from Catherine here, which I think goes more to the cultural aspects and the organizational aspects of getting a good architecture. What can be done to evaluate how good or bad my architecture is? With digital transformation, I'm required to deliver data more quickly to the organization, and I'd like to understand how to evaluate where I'm at and how to improve.
Well, so a little bit of experience. So, this is something that we actually offer for free, because we kind of know the little things to look for. And like I pointed out, some of them, are, seeing a lot of these, from a MicroStrategy architecture perspective, seeing these, multi-key tables, as well as, like I said, just at a bare minimum using views. This kind of simply, there's probably a few more, nuanced elements that we kind of go through in a broader, kind of thing. But I can certainly kind of typically look at, spend an hour looking at some things and get a pretty good idea as to how mature you are, an organization company is, or whether or not we need to kind of go back and revisit that foundation. So some of it's a little bit of experience, but then I think it's two parts of it is, that technical architecture. And then the other part really is that, functional, and what I kind of spoke about in my prior thing is really treating it as a product. Analytics and data as a product is also fundamental to data transformation. And so your architect and your architecture, or your people leading this, need to really understand deeply both the technical and the functional aspects.
Good. Well, we're out of questions in the Q&A. I have one for myself that kind of bridges the last talk in this one as well, Ryan. Of the top tips that you've given for the architecture in this presentation, which would you say are most important to enabling self-service in the enterprise and making people more independent in looking at data and getting analysis?
Well, that's a little bit of a loaded question. I typically see self-service still as a buzzword and maybe a little bit of a holy grail. So some of it still goes back to that doing proper architecture, getting your subject areas aligned, and being able to do what we call report builders, or object prompted templates that people can say select. I know these 100 attributes work together. I know these 50 or 100 metrics work together, and these filters work together. And so they're more curated or sandbox versions, right? So that I see as a little bit more of still, it's self-service. I can ask kind of any question I want, but it's not me dropping directly from schema objects, because you can have everything in there. Not everything works or works at the same level. And then, or conversely, being able to do a lot of the data import and you do that, and it kind of works, but you ultimately get to, this is a data import. How do I repeat that process? How do I automate getting this data in when it's an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is? So you ultimately go back to kind of a question I answered the prior session was, I still think you still operationalize ETL and data and bring this in semantically. So you start bringing this out. And the way one of the things how I think about architecture and MicroStrategy, I think a lot of this about kind of like a tree. And you kind of have a core set of data, a core set of dimensions that you're almost always joining on. And then you have your fact tables, and they kind of branch out as roots, right? And you kind of have the connections. And then you have your branches of all the characteristics and the snowflake, but that kind of characteristic attributes of the bigger branches on through. So that you kind of carry that through from an architecture perspective, and that almost permeates. And so you get to the self-service, and it's a little bit of it's a buzzword, and there's ways to do it, but you want to also get the most value and really embrace data democratization.
No, I think that's well taken. The holy grail of self-service as being everybody looking at all the data is kind of not a true thing, right? This needs to be sandboxed or even taken to the level of guided analytics at some point.
Right. Yeah, because even visualizations, people need the education on it, right? To understand how to read a visualization and how to read the data.
Well, that's great. I want to thank you again, Ryan, for some great insights. A great presentation. Thank you. Thank you to all the attendees. I hope you enjoy the last few sessions here at Microstrategy World 2021. Thanks again, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.